It's become fashionable in some circles to discount the Ten Commandments and say, well, it's much like many of the ancient law codes, Hammurabi's code, for example. But there's one commandment that sets the Ten Commandments apart from every other ancient law. In fact, sets it apart from most laws in general. And in this lesson, that's exactly what we're going to be talking about. So let's get to it. Beware covetousness. Yes, that's the command we're talking about, the 10th commandment. Beware of covetousness. It's a long word and a word we don't hear generally speaking in ordinary conversation. But covetousness is something which we see a lot of in our own lives and in our society in general. And it is something to be aware of. And we'll look at the reasons why. The memory text is found in Luke 12:15. Take heed and beware. Now, this is kind of interesting. There's a double whammy here. Take heed and beware. Two things you need to be. So it's very important you watch out for this, of covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. Well, on the one hand, we could say, well, that's kind of self-evident. On another hand, we could say, you know what? That isn't self-evident at all. Most of us look around in the world around us, and people think, hey, you really got it made. If you got a lot of things, a lot of possessions, why, that must mean that you've made it in some sense. But in fact, we're being told here that it does not. So, if it doesn't consist, if our lives do not consist of the abundance of things that we possess, then what does life consist of? And what are the important things? And how do we know when we're coveting or when someone else is? Those are tough questions. Let's look at them. Now, the author of the lesson is very astutely points out and submits that covetous may be the ultimate original sin. Why? Well, because that was what Lucifer expresses in Ezekiel and Isaiah. I will be like the Most High. Okay? I want to be like him. I want what I can't have. I want what doesn't belong to me. It is not my natural, it does not belong to me by nature. It is not something that is appropriate for me. There are a lot of things we want that are not appropriate for us. But it not only was it Lucifer's sin, the author fails to point out that it was also humankind's first sin, because the serpent says to the woman that when you eat of this, you will be like God. Lucifer's sin was he wanted to be like God, and he knew how tempting that could be. And so when he wanted to win over humanity to his side, he tempted humanity with that which he himself had fallen for. And he was a superior being than we were, and it worked pretty well. You can be like God. You can be all powerful. You can know what God has not told you. But all of these things are things which were not given to humankind. Humankind was given a very exalted status to be the viceroys, the vice regents, to have dominion over this world, to care for and to be cared by for this world. The world is a great place prepared for us. Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. It also follows that then creation was made for man and not man for creation. Although there is this symbiotic relationship very early in Genesis, that the world was created for us and for our delight, but it was also created that we should delight in caring for it. And this shouldn't be terribly hard to understand, but we have the same experience with our own children. that we have a hand in creating. So, not only Lucifer's sin, but also humankind's first sin, the to covet a status which does not rightfully belong to us, and to seek to get it through means which God has put off limits. Don't eat of that tree. And what happens is that covetousness leads us to desire things which do not belong to us. Now let's take a fancy car, for example. Well, we could work for that, and we could work to afford it, and it might be a wise thing to do. It might then become something that we should have, but it might be something that maybe is just a sign of luxury that would not be good for our souls anyway. So these things are not always clear cut. Covetousness is like that. It's very hard to nail down. It's hard to put your finger on. But it turns out that covetousness, as we say, was the ultimate original sin. It is what entrapped Lucifer and is what he used to entrap humanity. But there's more to it than that. The 10th commandment against covetousness is the commandment, and we alluded to this at the beginning. It sets the Decalogue apart from every other ancient law. There are lots of ancient laws against murder. A society which allows murder and doesn't punish it will devolve into violence. We see this clearly demonstrated in the first chapters of Genesis, that when Cain is not punished for murder, no one is punished for murder. By the time we get to the 6th generation from Cain to Lamech, it's he brags about killing people. So you get a very violent society. There are laws against theft. When you have no laws against theft, then the strong steals from the weak, and society breaks down again, because the clever, who may not have power, have no incentive to invent new things or to become productive, because it will just be taken from them. The fruits of their labor will be taken from them. Something which will not happen in heaven. Now, I'm not suggesting that we'll be doing a lot of inventing, although I don't know. Creativity is part of God's nature. He put it in our nature as well. But it says that we shall not plant vineyards and another enjoy them. We will have the fruits of our own labor. There'll be some sense of property. And so theft cannot happen. Lying cannot happen. Society breaks down when trust breaks down. All of these things in the ancient laws, in the ancient world, there are laws against some of these things, fraud in contract, for example, and for good reason. Again, even the wicked could recognize that certain kinds of sin, if tolerated, will destroy the society, and a king's kingdom can be destroyed by terrible behavior, and even terrible behavior by the king. If he totally disrespects the rights of his subjects, then they may rebel. They may things just devolve into poverty and disorder. Which if people choose to disobey the king in large numbers, there's no way. You'd have to have a policeman for every citizen, and then the police would all have to be proper. So it just doesn't work unless people voluntarily obey and voluntarily practice civilized behavior, which means no murder, no adultery, no theft, no lying under oath, things like that. So the 10 Commandments, because they have a law against coveting, against what goes on in your head, there's no other ancient law system that that outlaws what you might desire. Just outlaws how you get it. But the 10 Commandments say that covetousness itself is against the law. It is a sin. The 10th commandment, unlike the others, deals with something which is not observable. You can observe the fruits of covetousness. Someone may stalk another person, for example, or they may steal or defraud. There are all kinds of things that may deceive in order to get what is not rightfully theirs. You can see the results of it, but you can't see the root of it. And that's true even of all modern law codes. And not only is it true that we do not legislate against what goes on in someone's head, well, let's put it this way, except for hate crimes and hate speech. These are things which we actually legislate against what's going on in your head instead of just your behavior, because there is no hate crime that is not a crime without the hate. And hateful speech can be slanderous or libelous, can have all other kinds of, it can be illegal in other ways. But we cannot assume hate. We cannot see it for certain. So as Christians, we should oppose hate laws. I know that people don't find this, they will find this, many of you perhaps will find this difficult to believe. But once we cross the line and start legislating against what people think instead of what they do, there's no going back. There are all kinds of things that might be outlawed if someone else believes that you think them. But so the 10th Commandment, this deals with those things which are not observable. And having said that, we should not be legislating against this. If you look into the ancient laws of Israel, there were penalties for murder, penalties for adultery, penalties for theft, penalties for lying under oath. But there was no penalty specified in their civil law for covetousness. Now, you can find plenty of texts in the Old Testament and the New Testament which tell us not to covet. And Isaiah and other prophets warn, if you're covetous, these will be the results. But this is talking about the consequences of covetousness in your own life. It is not talking about something that the king was supposed to enforce or that the local judges were supposed to enforce, unlike murder, theft, and so on. So it is a deep, and the other thing about it, which is not really pointed out in the lesson, but is really important, in many ways, covetousness is the root of all the other sins. To have no other gods before God, we covet some kind of power or control that we don't feel like we're getting from God. We want something better than, different than God, we think. To take God's name in vain is to assume to ourselves a power that does not belong to us. And we want that. We covet that. And covetousness comes in the root of all of these sins. We want something and someone gets in our way, and so we kill them. Covetousness is the root in many ways of all sin. And the Ten Commandments recognizes that, and it's the hint that comes before the Sermon on the Mount. Now, Jesus says, you've heard that it said, thou shalt not kill. And he says, I tell you, if you hate your brother, that you're guilty already. Well, his point is that murder is the result of an attitude of a thought. And we to become fully perfect, if that were possible, we would deal not merely with actions, but with attitudes as well. It's our attitudes that bring out these terrible actions. They reveal what is going on in our heart. They reveal our covetousness in many ways. And so coveting is at the root of virtually all the other sins. It is desiring that which does not rightfully belong to us and seeking to obtain it through means which are not rightful. So that's why we should beware of covetousness, because, again, in its train, we hear people say money is the root of all evil. Well, first of all, the text does not say that. The text says the love of money is the root of many kinds of evil. That's the better translation. But the love of money, of course, is coveting again. I want more. This is the famous statement by John D. Rockefeller. How much money, they said to Rockefeller, is enough? And he said, a little more. That shows the root of covetousness in We all feel that way. If you have enough, well, yeah. Would you like more? Yeah, I would. Covetousness is at the base of our sinful nature. We do not trust God. Are not willing to let God be God. We'd like to take over, at least in an advisory capacity. So covetousness is, in fact, this dangerous sin, and it takes many forms. Now, we're going to cover in a later lesson. The problem of many of these lessons is that they're looking at stewardship and covetousness specifically here in terms merely of money, of material things, materialism. And a materialistic view means that you find materialistic outcomes and materialistic causes and so forth. But there's much more to stewardship than materialism. There's much more. There's spiritual. There is such a thing as spiritual coveting. In fact, well, let's take a look at some of the people who were covetousness, who were used as examples in this lesson. And let's see if we can figure out what they were coveting. What does it mean to be covetous in that case? So what did they covet? The first example we'll have is Achan, because that's the one that's used. Now, if you don't remember, Achan is the one who, after they were told when Jericho was defeated that they were not to plunder it. Now, we take the word plunder in an extremely negative way, and it's not a good thing, don't misunderstand me. But in ancient times, plunder was the majority of a soldier's pay. In fact, in just the majority, in very ancient times, it pretty much was all they had. They might get food and armament from in the army, but they didn't get pay. The pay was in the plunder. And that's why one of the reasons people would undertake it, you could become fairly wealthy if you survived. And and this was common. The soldier expected to, grab whatever was lying around loose and take it. We see this even as early as Abraham, when he rescues Lot, and he allows his men to plunder, but he takes nothing. So he allows them to plunder, not because he's indulging their evil impulses, but because that's how they get paid. So they're told when Jericho falls that they are not to plunder it. They are not to receive any pay for this because they didn't do anything. They marched around the city. God is the one who conquered Jericho. And to not plunder it was a recognition that God had been the one who did all of the work, shall we say, all the heavy lifting, that they had acted in faith, and then that God had destroyed the city. And that meant that the plunder belonged to God in their minds, in the ancient mind. And if something belongs to God, it becomes sacred. That's just the nature of the beast. When whatever God has is sacred. And so when Achan plundered, he didn't just take something which had been from a conquered city. He took something sacred, something that belonged to God. Achan wanted the plunder so badly. He wanted something out of this so much that he was willing to rob God. We usually use that in another text, another context. Will a man rob God? But that's essentially what Achan did. And because Achan represented the way they understood their relationship with God is that God had a relationship with all of Israel. Israel was his bride. And that when one person would violate that, then the body of the assembly, as they were called. I always love the fact that the Hebrew word for the assembly is Knesset, which is the same name for the Israeli parliament today, the Knesset, the assembly. And that's the term that's used in the Old Testament, the Knesset. And the way, if one part of the Knesset, the assembly, all of the people of Israel, if one of them violated this, then the entire group was in violation. And that's why the punishment was often to be cut off from the camp, that is, to be sent out. They were no longer considered a part of the Knesset, or they were to be executed. And we think, oh, this is terribly barbaric. But the point is, they didn't have a lot of punishments available to them. And as they understood their relationship with God, and as he made it clear to them, that for one of them to take what was sacred, as Achan did, was treason. It was not merely taking something that didn't belong to you or even taking something from God. It was to endanger the entire community. And therefore, the punishment was severe. Now, we can say that we understand a lot more about God now and that he wouldn't want that. But the point is, God meets people where they are. And believe it or not, this was a much more humane system in Israel than in many of the places, many of the other kingdoms around. We're not at all humane. We could go through, I don't like to go through the ghastly and gory things that kings did to one another or to their subjects who disobeyed. But believe me, stoning was one of the milder things that could happen to you. And again, it was seen as treason. You didn't when this happened, you didn't just violate your relationship, your personal relationship with God. You endangered me. You endangered my family. And that's why the punishments were so severe. So what did Achan covet? Well, this is a pretty easy one, really, because it's pretty clear Achan wanted the material goods. He knew he was doing wrong because he hid them. This was premeditated treason in their view. He intentionally did this thing. He endangered the entire community. Not only did he endanger the community, but they suffered casualties, deaths and injuries in battle because of what Achan had done. So this endangered the entire community. And Achan, for material gain, had endangered his people. And that's why the punishment was so severe. But Achan is a very simple case of coveting. The other cases we're going to cover aren't as obvious as even the lesson wants to make it seem. Judas, and he makes a great deal of the fact that Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. But I'm going to tell you right now, that is not what Judas wanted. How do I know this? How can I make such a strong claim? Because we're told when Judas realized that Jesus had been arrested, had allowed himself to be arrested, he went to the priests, to the temple, and he threw the 30 pieces of silver at them. If he wanted that, if that's why he did it, why would he throw it back? He said, I have betrayed innocent blood. Well, isn't that what he thought he was doing? According to the materialistic view, he was willing to betray his master for the price of a slave, 30 pieces of silver. That's what the general take is, and unfortunately, it's kind of the take we have in our lesson. But Judas was not coveting 30 pieces of silver. Now, it does say that he was a thief. John, the apostle, in his account of the woman of Bethany and the perfume, says that he had that Judas was a thief, that he was taking. But there was a lot more to being the treasurer. I'm saying a lot more than 30 pieces of silver. He just kept, as long as he kept the books, he could always have a little for himself. 30 pieces of silver was relatively minor stuff compared to the ongoing expenses. But we have from his own mouth this surprise. I've betrayed innocent blood. What did he think he was doing? Well, he didn't think he was doing that. And he wasn't doing it for the silver because he threw it back. So if he didn't do it for the silver and he didn't want Jesus to be betrayed, he didn't want to betray innocent blood, what did he think he was doing? Well, we can only speculate. There is no way of saying that this is absolute, but I would submit to you that it's very likely that what he was doing, remember that the continual argument, including the last one that Judas was involved in at the Last Supper, was who was going to be the greatest in the kingdom. Judas wanted to be the greatest in the kingdom. He wanted Jesus to establish his kingdom, and Judas wanted himself to be elevated to a high position in that kingdom. it seems pretty clear that what he did by provoking the arrest is that he expected that Jesus would not allow himself to be arrested, would certainly not allow himself to be taken away and crucified. Jesus would assert his authority, use his power, and establish his kingdom, and all of the apostles, and especially Judas in this case, would be elevated to positions of power. I don't think it's pretty clear to me that Judas didn't covet 30 pieces of silver. No. He coveted the power of being in the government, and he thought the best thing Jesus had come for. Jesus, he was sure, was the Messiah, and he was sure the Messiah was one who would establish his kingdom, throw off the Roman yoke, and elevate his disciples. And when that didn't happen, he was bereft. He was inconsolable, literally. He throws down the money and says, "Oh, I betrayed innocent blood. I thought I was doing something good, and instead I've done something terrible." And because he never really understood Jesus, in spite of spending 3.5 years with him. And by the way, one of these times we'll get into that none of them really understood Jesus, which is borne out by all the Gospels, but especially by Luke. But Judas really didn't understand Jesus. And having betrayed innocent blood, and having brought an end to the kingdom, the end of all his hopes, the very thing he coveted, he had destroyed. And having come to that realization, he committed suicide. So Judas didn't covet 30 pieces of silver. He coveted power which was not to be his. He coveted forcing Jesus to do something which Jesus was not going to do. And that was what led to his terrible betrayal. And it's a really tragic and terrible story. So Achan coveted the actual physical goods. He wanted the goods, and he was going to get them, hide them, and keep them. No one would know. Judas didn't covet the 30 pieces of silver. He coveted the power that he might have, and he coveted the kingdom that he understood Jesus to be establishing, not the real one, but the one in Judas's own imagination. So coveting can be different things. It isn't always materialistic. Again, if it was materialistic, you don't throw the money back. You at least keep that. And then Ananias and Sapphira. And this is, again, there's a great deal of talk about how much they coveted the profit from their property. That's not what they coveted. As Peter told them, you could have kept it all. If what they were coveting was the money from that property, they would never have volunteered any of it. But they sold the property, apparently, and gave half the money. And then Peter asked them, and they asked Ananias, is this everything? And Ananias said, yes, it's everything. So what was it he was coveting? He wasn't coveting the 50% of the money, or he kept it. But that isn't why he offered the other 50% to begin with. No, Ananias and Sapphira both, because they both said the same thing, even though Sapphira came in, her husband was dead. Maybe she did not realize that. Is this everything? Yes, it's everything. What they coveted was the appearance of charity, of righteousness. They coveted, they were hypocrites. They wanted to be seen as giving all of this without actually doing it. As someone has said, a hypocrite is someone who does not intend to be what they pretend to be. And that was what was happening here. But they were coveting a sense of, we would today call it virtue signaling. They were virtue signaling. They were bringing money and saying, this is for our property we sold. Is it everything? Yes. But of course it wasn't everything. And so yeah, this is simply virtue signaling. You want to be seen to be more virtuous than you are. So you do something not because it's the right thing to do, not because you have some impulse to benefit others, but because you want to look good. You want to show other people that I'm the right kind of person. So Ananias and Sapphira did. They coveted virtue signal. They coveted status within the community of the church. And boy, this one is a frightening one to me, because I think it's very easy as followers of God and as members of congregations to want to appear to be much more virtuous than we are. So Ananias and Sapphira, we need to be careful about condemning them and talking about money when it's really something else. And I'm afraid I'm too old and too experienced to believe that this is a rare thing, that people want to appear virtuous without being virtuous. I'm afraid it happens to every church every year, and I'm afraid it happens that I do this more often than I'd like to think. And that comes then to another situation. How do we overcome covetousness? Because we cannot really see it in others. We can see the results of it. We can see the actions that flow from it, but we cannot really see it in others. And the real problem with that is even greater, and that is we cannot see it in ourselves at all. The heart is desperately wicked. Don't we say that? And deceitful above all things. And who's the first one who's deceived? By our own hearts. Well, I'm deceived by my heart. I want to think myself better than I am. My virtue signaling probably is for my own self before it is for anyone else. How do we overcome covetousness? Well, yes, there are things we can talk about and things we can do, I suppose. But the real answer is, how can we overcome something we aren't even always aware of? And this is where it comes to something that I talk about, the 7 levels of relationship, what it means to have a saving relationship with God. And that is where certain biblical texts come into play, because this is a universal human problem. We cannot see covetousness in ourselves. Our hearts are deceitful, and we're the first ones to fall for our own virtue signaling. And no one understood this better probably than the psalmist. And he puts it this way: who can discern his errors? Acquit me of hidden faults. He's praying to God only in this deep relationship of vulnerability to God, and even intimacy, where we allow God to point out those things which we do not see. Intimacy, vulnerability is where we say, Lord, I'm struggling with this. Intimacy is where we say, God, tell me things that I don't see that I'm struggling with. And that can be very, very frightening. Who can discern his own errors? It doesn't say own, but who can discern? How can any of us see our own mistakes? Acquit me of hidden faults. Also, keep your servant back from presumptuous sins. That is, willful sins I know I'm committing. There was no sacrifice for willful sin in the ancient Israeli system. And so he's saying, there are things I don't know I'm doing. Please forgive me for those. Acquit me of those. Declare me not guilty. Also, keep me back from presumptuous sins. Let them not rule over me. Yeah, and Paul says that we're slaves of sin. Yeah, there you go. They're ruling over us. Then, when you acquit me of the things I haven't seen, and when you help me, you keep me back from the things that I know are sin, then I will be innocent and blameless of great wrongdoing. And then you ask this, because this is where covetousness comes in. It's in the meditations of one's heart. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart, the thoughts that I speak and the thoughts that are behind the speech, may both of these be acceptable in your sight, Lord, my rock and my redeemer. This is a prayer of abject trust and belief in God. And this is where we come to the words of my mouth. Yes, this is the whole property. Well, what are the thoughts behind it? They know it's not the whole property, but they want to be thought of well. So you see how this thing fits together. So the actions, the words of my mouth, the things that I actually do, and the thoughts that that spring out as these actions, may all those be acceptable in your sight. Help me to have the right kinds of thoughts, and that includes, and probably even begins, seeing it as a part of the original sin, it begins with covetousness. And one more psalm. Search me, O God. Know my heart. I can't know it. You don't show it to me. I don't have a chance. Put me to the test. Now, this is interesting because putting to the test is the same word as temptation. When it says you shall not tempt the Lord your God, it says you won't put him to the test. Put me to the test and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there's any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. So he's saying, you have permission, Lord. Do whatever it takes to root out. You can see. Search me, find these things, root them out, whatever the pain is to me, and help me to be a child of yours. Lead me in the everlasting way. Yes, covetousness is the root of all the other sins. And coveting material things is probably down the list of dangers. Coveting spiritual things, in one way, is the worst thing to do. To covet the sense of moral superiority. A lot of that is going around these days. To covet recognition as a moral being, instead of saying, no, I do the best I can to follow my Lord. Well, that's it for covetousness for this week. I hope that it's useful to you. Again, we certainly would love to have you like this and share it, and press the bell for notifications so you never miss one of these videos. If you'd like to support us, there are a number of ways of doing that. Prayer certainly is one of them. Financially, you can support us by becoming a Patreon at patreon.com/Bible Journeys. And anytime you want to contact me, you can do so at BibleJourneys@yahoo.com. May the Lord bless this lesson in your life, and may he bless you until we can meet again and embark on another Bible journey together.